My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 33 years old, and for exactly 21 days I watched my neighbors build a tennis court over the one thing keeping every septic system in our subdivision alive. Then I watched 18 finished basements turn into toxic swimming pools. The strangest part wasn't that it happened. It was that I spent weeks trying to stop it, and the people responsible laughed because they thought a landscaping company understood sewage better than an environmental engineer. Looking back now, I don't even remember the tennis court anymore. What I remember is the smell, the panic in people's voices, and the moment I realized that being right doesn't always feel like winning. Back in 2020, I bought a small place in Willow Creek Estates, about 40 minutes outside Charlotte, North Carolina. It wasn't the nicest neighborhood, but it was quiet, full of young families, retirees, and people who waved when you drove by. The house itself needed work, which didn't bother me because I've always been the kind of guy who enjoys fixing things with my own hands. What did bother people was the drainage ditch behind my backyard. It stretched nearly the entire width of my property, about 10 feet across, deep enough that kids couldn't safely climb into it, overgrown with weeds and brush that made it look abandoned. More than one neighbor asked why I didn't just fill it in and plant grass. I usually smiled and said, "Because it isn't really my ditch." They'd laugh, assuming I was joking. I wasn't. I work as an environmental engineer. My job has taken me to wastewater treatment plants, flood control projects, and septic system failures all over the state. You develop a strange appreciation for things most people never notice. Pipes hidden underground, drainage channels beside highways, retention ponds everyone complains about until the first hurricane shows up. Ugly infrastructure keeps nice neighborhoods alive. That's just reality. During closing, the previous owner handed me a worn folder full of old subdivision documents. Most buyers probably would have tossed it in a drawer forever. I actually read it. Buried inside was the original development plat from the early 90s, showing a protected septic drainage easement crossing several backyards, including mine. That ugly ditch wasn't decorative. It was the pressure relief and overflow path serving every septic field in the subdivision. It had been engineered that way decades earlier because of the heady clay soil underneath our neighborhood. Block that path, and eventually wastewater would have nowhere left to go except backward. I remember thinking, well, that's something nobody else probably knows. I never imagined how important that sentence would become. About a year after I moved in, our homeowners association elected a new president named Richard Holloway. Richard loved projects. He loved presentations. He loved talking about property values every chance he got. If someone suggested repainting the mailbox, Richard somehow turned it into a speech about increasing neighborhood prestige. At first, I figured he was harmless, just another retired businessman looking for something to manage. Then the newsletter started. New entrance signs, decorative lighting, community gardens, brick monuments. Every month, there was another expensive idea. During one summer meeting, he rolled out a giant display board covered with glossy renderings like he was unveiling a luxury resort. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with a grin, "Willow Creek deserves amenities that match today's market." He pulled away the cover, revealing a beautiful tennis court surrounded by fresh landscaping, benches, decorative fencing, and flowering trees. People immediately started nodding. Someone actually clapped. Richard pointed directly at the map. "This unused drainage area behind several homes is wasted space. We transform this into recreation. Property values go up across the board." My stomach tightened before he even finished speaking because I recognized the location instantly. It wasn't unused. It was the septic easement. I raised my hand. Richard gave me that polite smile people wear when they already know they don't want your opinion. "Go ahead, Ethan." I stood up and walked closer to the display. "That ditch isn't empty land," I said. "It's part of the subdivision's septic drainage system. If you bury it, wastewater loses its emergency flow path." The room went quiet for maybe 3 seconds before Richard chuckled. "Well, that's certainly one perspective." A few people laughed with him. I stayed calm. "It isn't a perspective. It's on the recorded plat filed with the county." Richard folded his arm. "We've already spoken with Green Horizon Landscaping. They told us grading the area would actually improve drainage." I honestly thought I'd misheard him. "A landscaping company?" I asked. "Richard, I literally design wastewater systems for a living." He shrugged. "And they build outdoor environments professionally." I could feel every eye in the room bouncing between us. "Those aren't the same thing," I replied. "Not even close." Richard leaned forward with a smile that somehow felt more insulting than yelling ever could. "Ethan, I appreciate your passion. But sometimes professionals become too focused on worst-case scenarios. We are trying to improve the community, not scare people. That word stayed with me. Scare. As if explaining basic engineering somehow made me an alarmist, instead of the only person in the room reading the actual plans. The board voted anyway. 7 in favor, 2 against. As chairs scraped across the floor and people gathered around the colorful drawings, complimenting the future tennis court, I quietly packed my folder back into my bag. Walking to my truck, I remember looking toward that overgrown ditch glowing orange in the evening sunlight. And for the first time since buying the house, it didn't look ugly anymore. It looked fragile, because I knew something everyone else had chosen not to believe. And deep down I had the uneasy feeling that before long, reality was about to cast the only vote that actually mattered. That night I spread every document across my dining room table like I was preparing evidence for a trial instead of getting ready for bed. The original subdivision plat, county easement records, engineering notes, old survey maps, even photographs I had taken the week I moved in. The more I looked, the more obvious it became that this wasn't some gray legal area open to interpretation. The easement was recorded, protected, and clearly labeled. It existed for one reason, and one reason only: to give 30 interconnected septic systems somewhere to relieve pressure when heavy rain saturated the surrounding soil. Without that corridor, the wastewater would eventually push backward through the path of least resistance. Gravity doesn't negotiate. Physics doesn't care about HOA votes. I scanned every page into my computer, highlighted the relevant sections, wrote a respectful letter explaining exactly what would happen if construction continued, and sent it by certified mail to Richard and every board member. I wasn't threatening anyone. I wasn't trying to embarrass them. I genuinely believed that once they saw the official documents, someone would stop the project. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with an email from Richard. It contained exactly one sentence. Please stop spreading unnecessary fear. Our contractor has everything under control. That was it. No questions. No request for clarification. No interest in seeing the documents I had attached. I sat there staring at my screen, longer than I care to admit, because sometimes arrogance isn't loud. Sometimes it's just dismissive enough to let you know your expertise means absolutely nothing if it gets in the way of someone's plans. Construction started the following morning. Dump trucks rolled through the neighborhood before most people had finished breakfast. Excavators trimmed away years of brush, then began pushing soil into the ditch. I stood in my backyard with a cup of coffee, watching operators who had no idea what they were burying. One of them waved at me. I waved back. None of this was their fault. They'd been hired to follow instructions, not question engineering decisions made by a homeowners association. Over the next week, nearly 40 truckloads of fill dirt disappeared into that channel. Every afternoon I took photographs from the exact same spot beside my fence. Date, time, progress, not because I wanted evidence against my neighbors, but because something inside me kept saying, "You're going to need this." My next-door neighbor, Linda, wandered over one evening while the crews were packing up. She looked at the nearly level ground and smiled. "I have to admit," she said, "it does look better." I nodded. "It does." She looked surprised. "I thought you hated the project." "I hate what happens after the project." Her smile faded. "You really think something bad's going to happen?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked, "Have you ever noticed you never smell septic problems around here, even after big storms?" She shook her head. "That's because the system has always had somewhere to breed." She stared at the dirt covering the old ditch, then quietly asked, "Should I be worried?" I wanted to tell her no. I really did. Instead, I said, "I hope I'm wrong." The tennis court came together unbelievably fast. Concrete forms appeared. Rebar went in. Fresh pavement followed. Decorative fencing surrounded the entire area before the month was over. Richard posted smiling pictures on the HOA Facebook page every evening. Exciting progress. Another improvement for Willow Creek. People commented with little tennis ball emojis and applause. I stopped reading after the third day. There wasn't any point. About 2 weeks later, I was eating dinner when my phone rang. It was Linda. She sounded nervous. "Ethan, my downstairs toilet just made the strangest noise." I asked her to describe it. "Like bubbling?" Then the water level changed. My stomach sank. "Don't run any more water tonight," I told her. "Call me if anything else happens." The next morning, another neighbor mentioned slow drains. Then another. Then another. Small symptoms. Easy to ignore if you wanted to. Richard certainly did. He sent out an email blaming aging plumbing and reminding residents to avoid flushing paper towels and baby wipes. I almost laughed when I read it because that explanation would have made sense if one house had problems. It made no sense when half the neighborhood started experiencing the exact same symptoms simultaneously. A few days later, I drove home from work and noticed a plumbing van parked outside the clubhouse. Curiosity got the better of me, so I walked over. The plumber was standing beside an open cleanout pipe with mud on his boots and frustration written across his face. Richard spotted me immediately. "Here comes our expert," he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. I ignored the sarcasm and asked the plumber what he'd found. Before Richard could interrupt, the man sighed. "Honestly," he said, "I've never seen anything quite like this." He pointed toward the new tennis court. "Whatever used to carry overflow through there is gone. The pressure has nowhere to relieve itself." Richard folded his arms. "Can you fix it?" The plumber looked at him for a long second before answering with a sentence I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. "Sir, I fix pipes. I don't fix physics." Nobody spoke after that. Richard thanked him, paid the invoice, and the plumber drove away. Instead of accepting what he'd just heard, Richard hired another company, then another. Every one of them focused on individual houses because that's what they'd been called to inspect. None of them could solve a neighborhood-wide design failure by replacing a few pipes, while everyone else chased symptoms. I quietly mailed another package, this one to the regional office of the Environmental Protection Agency. Inside were copies of the subdivision plat, construction photos, meeting minutes showing I had objected before work began, copies of Richard's email dismissing my concerns, and a timeline documenting exactly when the easement had been buried. I didn't do it out of revenge. At least that's what I told myself. The truth is more complicated. Part of me still hoped the government would intervene before families got hurt, because once wastewater starts surfacing, every hour matters. 3 mornings later, I woke up to pounding on my front door. It was Linda. She was crying before I even opened it completely. "It's coming up through the basement drain." I grabbed my boots and followed her across the yard. I smelled it before I reached the stairs. If you've ever worked around wastewater, you never forget that smell. Thick, sour, heavy enough to stick in the back of your throat. Black water covered nearly half the basement floor. Family photos floated against storage bins. Children's toys drifted slowly through the filthy water. Linda just stood there shaking her head. "How does this even happen?" she whispered. I closed my eyes for 1 second, because I knew the answer. By that afternoon, it wasn't just Linda's house anymore. 2 homes became 5. 5 became 11. Before sunset, emergency restoration trucks lined both sides of the street, and every conversation sounded exactly the same. Our shower backed up. The laundry room flooded. The downstairs bathroom exploded. Parents carried children through garages to avoid contaminated water. Contractors hauled out soaked drywall and carpets. People who had applauded the tennis court 3 weeks earlier now stood in clusters staring at it in complete silence, as if the smooth concrete itself had betrayed them. And standing in the middle of that crowd was Richard, still insisting nobody should jump to conclusions, just as 3 white government SUVs slowly turned into the entrance of Willow Creek Estates. The first thing everyone noticed wasn't the vehicles. It was the people stepping out of them wearing protective gear. White coveralls, gloves, respirators, sample kits. Suddenly, the situation nobody wanted to believe had become impossible to ignore. The EPA team introduced themselves, asked everyone to remain outside the affected areas, and immediately began collecting soil, groundwater, and wastewater samples. Richard tried greeting them with the same polished confidence he used during HOA meetings. "I'm sure this is all just a temporary plumbing issue," he said with a smile that looked more nervous than convincing. The lead investigator barely looked up from his clipboard. "Sir, we'll let the testing answer that." Over the next several hours, they photographed the tennis court, compared my documents with the county records, and walked the entire length of what used to be the drainage easement. One investigator stopped beside me and quietly asked, "You're the engineer who submitted this package?" I nodded. He glanced toward the concrete court and simply said, "I wish someone had listened sooner." A week later, the laboratory results confirmed exactly what everyone had feared. Dangerous levels of E. coli contamination had spread throughout the affected area, forcing extensive remediation plans that would cost far more than anyone imagined. The county issued emergency orders. Environmental notices appeared at the entrance of the subdivision, and suddenly every local news station wanted to know how a neighborhood improvement project had turned into a public health disaster. The next HOA meeting was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The same clubhouse where people had applauded glossy renderings weeks earlier was now packed with angry homeowners demanding answers. Richard walked to the podium carrying prepared remarks, but he never finished them. One resident stood up holding photographs of her flooded basement. Another held invoices from restoration companies. A father described taking his little daughter to urgent care after she developed a skin infection from contaminated water. The room erupted. For the first time since I'd met Richard, nobody wanted another speech about property values. They wanted accountability. Within days, nearly every affected family joined together and filed a lawsuit against Richard and the remaining board members, seeking damages for cleanup costs, property losses, and restoration of the protected easement. Because the meeting minutes clearly showed that I had voted against the project, submitted written warnings beforehand, and documented everything from the beginning. The attorneys removed me from the list of potential defendants almost immediately. It felt strange sitting on the outside watching neighbors I'd tried to help prepare for depositions. But the paperwork spoke for itself. Facts have a quiet way of surviving even when opinions don't. The HOA's reserve account wasn't even close to covering the damage. Insurance refused to pay for decisions that ignored recorded easements and engineering warnings. Before Thanksgiving, Richard filed for personal bankruptcy. Not long afterward, I heard that his wife had moved out. Months later, I spotted him picking up passengers while driving for a rideshare company. We made eye contact through the windshield for just a second. Neither of us waved. There wasn't anything left to say. The real cost, though, wasn't measured in lawsuits. Monthly HOA dues skyrocketed as the remaining homeowners struggled to finance emergency repairs. Families who had planned to retire there quietly put their houses on the market. Most sat unsold. Buyers don't get excited about neighborhoods with environmental warning signs at the entrance. I eventually sold my own house to an investment company that specialized in distressed properties. Walking away wasn't easy. I had loved that little place despite everything that happened there. But every time I looked into my backyard, I no longer saw the peaceful evenings I'd once enjoyed. I saw the moment common sense lost to ego. Then something happened that still makes me shake my head whenever people ask how the story ended. The EPA hired me as an environmental consultant during the remediation process. For months, I helped oversee the restoration of the same drainage system I had begged the HOA not to destroy in the first place. Every report I wrote, every inspection I completed, every recommendation I made was based on principles I tried to explain before the first shovel ever touched the ground. They paid me well for that work, and I won't pretend it wasn't satisfying. But there was never any celebration attached to those paychecks because every dollar represented a problem that never should have existed. A few years have passed since then. Last time I drove through Willow Creek Estates, the tennis court was gone. The restored drainage corridor had replaced it, not because anyone suddenly appreciated ugly infrastructure, but because reality finally forced them to. Quite a few homes still sat empty. Property values had never fully recovered, and the neighborhood carried scars that couldn't simply be landscaped away. As for me, I used the money I earned during the cleanup as part of the down payment on another home connected to the city sewer system. No septic easements. No HOA board trying to redesign infrastructure they didn't understand. Just quiet evenings and one lesson I'll probably carry for the rest of my life. The ugliest part of a neighborhood is sometimes the most important part. Because good engineering rarely wins beauty contests, but it quietly protects lives every single day. I'd love to hear what you think. If you had been one of my neighbors, would you have trusted the engineer with the boring documents or the HOA president with the beautiful drawings? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always divide people. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA that thought confidence mattered more than competence, share your experience. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.